Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for our September edition of Expanding the Frontiers of Economics webinar series. The title of our session today is Reimagining the IMF for a New Economic World Order. The fact that the IMF, though with some lag, has allocated SDRs worth $650 billion to combat current crisis due to the ongoing pandemic highlights the role of IMF in assisting nations, especially the developing ones. To further discuss what the IMF can do and should do to help build our world better and our economies better, we have with us our very own coordinator, Dr. Aqdas Afzal. And further to comment and discuss his ideas, we have with us one of the most sought after economists, Professor Jayati Ghosh. Now I hand it over to Satwik to formally welcome and introduce our speakers to the audience. Over to you, Satwik.
Thank you very much. Aqdas will be speaking first. He's our main speaker. Dr. Aqdas Afzal is the program director and assistant professor at the School of Development at the Habib University in Karachi. He was a Fulbright scholar, and in my humble opinion, he's one of the economists with a human face from South Asia. So with this, your introduction is over. Professor Jayati Ghosh, she's one of the most known economists from India, and she's one of the leading public intellectual also from India. And she's also one of the women economists, the female economist, in a very male-dominated profession. So with this, I will invite Dr. Afzal to give a speech. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to everyone to this very interesting talk. Thank you to Shotik and Anisha for organizing this. Like we mentioned, there is a very interesting working group within the Young Scholars Initiative that economics lovers or people who watch economics with a lot of interest started a couple of years ago, and I think we have been doing a number of these interesting events and webinars. So welcome to all of you watching this. I personally wanted to thank Dr. Ghosh for taking out the time from a very busy schedule and gracing us on this occasion. So without further ado, I am going to just put some points in front of you for discussion. So, as we all know, that COVID-19 has been an unmitigated economic catastrophe for the entire world. I mean, even more so for the developing world, where it has turned into an existential public health crisis for so many people. I mean, according to World Bank's own numbers, just within South Asia, the number of poor people is going to increase between 50 and 100 million. And if you just look at my native Pakistan, according to the work done by two leading Pakistani economists, 20 million more people are going to be pushed below the poverty line just in Pakistan. Now that is roughly 10% of Pakistan's population. So we are talking about an additional 10% of the population being pushed below the poverty line in this country. Different countries have undertaken massive, how should I say, economic policies to bring about economic growth in the, which was interrupted in the wake of COVID-19. So if we look at what has been going on in developed countries, we see that they've been able to inject a massive amount of economic stimulus in their economy. So according to calculations, the total amount of economic stimulus that the Western, or I shouldn't say Western, but developed countries have been able to inject in their economies is something in the neighborhood of $16 to $20 trillion. Whereas because developing countries lack fiscal space, or the fact that their fiscal space has become even more narrow compared to before, because economies were disrupted, the revenue streams were not coming in, they haven't really been able to inject the kind of economic stimulus which would have had a tangible impact on their economies. Into all of this, what the IMF calls two-track recovery that has been going on. So it's a two-track recovery because the developed world is seeing robust economic growth. I mean, the US is going to see its strongest growth since 1984, whereas the developing countries are just barely managing. So within this world that is showing us this two-track recovery in terms of economics, we've just had a very interesting case of the IMF issuing special drawing rights to the tune of $650 billion. Now, this is only the second time that the IMF has done this. I mean, the last time this was done was during the financial crisis of 2008 and 9. But something really interesting and odd has taken place as far as this issuance of SDRs is concerned. Out of $650 billion, only $21 billion are going to go as SDRs to low-income countries, whereas rich countries are going to rake in about $375 billion. This comes on top of IMF's own calculations that low-income countries are going to need about $450 billion over the next 5 years to help with economic growth. The IMF's own calculations indicate that in order to vaccinate about 40% of the global population, about $50 billion are required. So the point of the discussion is that given the way international economic world order is organized at the moment, low-income countries just do not have the kind of economic muscle to bring about economic recovery, one. And second, the way the IMF operates in the world, the way they make their decisions, the way they come out with their policies, there is very little input from low-income countries. So I recently wrote an op-ed in one of Pakistan's leading English language newspaper, which was titled Life After IMF, in which I made a case to reorganize, reimagine the IMF in such a way so that in the years to come, low-income countries can have more say as far as IMF's policies are concerned, so that this $650 billion of special drawing rights could be distributed not on the basis of how big a country's economy is, but on the basis of population and on the basis of how much a particular economy has been hit by COVID-19. So these were some of the points that I wanted to put in front of you. And the last point that I want to make before I turn the floor over to Dr. Ghosh. Recently, the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, wrote in the Financial Times, and she said that there is a hope and expectation from rich countries that they are going to simply use the massive amount of money that is being given to them by the IMF in the special drawing rights. The expectation is that these rich countries are going to give or donate this money to poor countries. But the problem is that these assets, because SDR is in the form of assets, are basically held by the central banks. And it is not entirely clear whether the central banks in these developed nations have the mandate to simply hand over these special drawing rights or this stimulus that they have obtained to the poor countries. So I think I am just going to stop here and request Dr. Ghosh to please enlighten us with some of the things that she has been writing about, especially when it comes to reimagining the IMF and also about this need to transfer technology. And I'm specifically referring to pharma patents to the developing world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aqdas. And that was very interesting. I think you managed to pack a lot into a very brief time. I also just want to say that I'm very happy to be back with YSI South Asia. I think you guys are great and you're doing a terrific job. So please keep it up. Yeah, so let's think, when we want to reimagine the IMF, let's think what it was supposed to do originally. In fact, the IMF, when it was set up in the Bretton Woods conference, it didn't meet what Keynes had expected. It didn't, it didn't have the same ambition that Keynes wanted, but it was still very ambitious. It actually was meant to be an institution that would cope with these global kinds of situations, like a global downswing, global challenges, global threats, and it would create stabilize economies, provide them foreign exchange when they need it, provide liquidity when required. So you will not get these shocks transmitting like dominoes across the system. That was the idea. It hasn't succeeded. Why? Essentially because, in a way, the idea that a global institution can do this leaves out power. And ultimately, Charles Kindleberger said it very well. Money is about power. International money is about international power. So no surprises that the US calls the shots in the IMF and also globally because of the huge power of the US dollar. Having said that, the way in which the IMF functions, yes, some of it is because of the voting rights and the way the voting rights are assigned, which is extremely unfortunate and is also, let's face it, out of date. I mean, even the quotas, there was some revision in the IMF quota system, but it's nowhere near even global shares of the economy anymore. But it's also unjust because it's not by population. And I think the point that Aqdas made, that you should be distributing SDR according to population, that's actually very valid and it's quite just. But the IMF, it's the worst part of it for me is not that developing countries have less voting rights. It's not. The worst part of it for me is the principles, the economic principles on which IMF still functions. And its functioning has been one which is driven by a failed economic model. Okay, I'm not going to call it, we can argue till the cows go home about whether it is neoliberal or whatever, but forget what it's called. It is a model that relies on fiscal austerity in downswings. It relies on compressing expenditure at a time when you want to increase the expenditure. And it is a model that has pretty much failed wherever it has been applied. Okay, in Asia, I did recently a study for a UN agency on looking at different developing countries in Asia and how they have volatility of capital and so on. The two cases that have been, I don't want to call it basket cases, but the two countries in the region that have had the most difficulty coping with it have continuously faced volatility and continue to be in deep distress are countries that have been continuously under IMF programs. Pakistan, a country that Aqdas comes from, and the Philippines. In other words, out of the past 40 years, I think Pakistan has been under an IMF program for 36 years, and Philippines almost in the whole period, that there is no year it has not been under an IMF program. So if you want any proof of the lack of efficacy of these programs, you need to look no further. It's a failed model. And what is so interesting about this COVID crisis is that the same IMF that continues to impose that same failed model even today, in its loan to Pakistan, it has asked for further regressive taxation measures, like increasing that, further cutbacks in public spending, like cutting down on public sector salaries, and so on. That same IMF, when it comes to the advanced economies, is happily telling them to spend more. Kristalina Georgieva and Geeta Gopinath have both celebrated the big fiscal expansion that Aqdas talked about in the advanced economies, correctly, because you need counter-cyclical spending. You need to have greater fiscal spending when you're in a downswing. They recognize that for the advanced economies. They impose the opposite on developing countries. Now you can ask, why are they doing this? Are they just bad people? No, they're not. And their origins, in fact, show that they would be sympathetic. Kristalina Georgieva herself is from Eastern Europe. Geeta is from India, right? So we know that they will be sympathetic to the problems of developing countries. Why are they insisting on this? Because they know that in the very, very financialized world of capital flows that we have today, any country that tries to increase the fiscal deficit in a period of downswing is going to face capital flight, right? I mean, you'll get downgraded by the credit agencies, you'll face capital flight, and then any IMF money that comes in is basically going to go out again in the form of this capital flight. You're not going to get any additional foreign exchange. There are solutions to this, though. So where the IMF is lacking is not just that it's imposing this failed model. It's lacking because it is not recognizing that the IMF itself could assist countries to avoid this outcome. It could say, we need capital controls. We need to prevent this very, very volatile mobile capital from rushing in, creating a currency overvaluation when it suits the developed world, and rushing out again in periods of crisis and adding to crisis. It is possible to do this. We can have an IMF that says we are going to insist on sovereign debt resolution mechanisms that actually prevent countries paying 20 times the original amount they borrowed, because the debt keeps getting rescheduled and the interest keeps getting added to the principal. And then there's this huge overhang of debt, which bears down on them, so that about 58 developing countries today are spending more on debt service than they are on health or any kind of COVID recovery strategies. We could have an IMF that says we as a global community will say there should be constraints on the credit rating agencies, so they cannot add to the problems and basically create capital flight, which is what is happening at the moment. So if we actually tried to reimagine an IMF, even imagining what was imagined at Bretton Woods, which was already, as I said, less ambition than Keynes had. But if we just go back to what was said at that conference about what kind of role the IMF could play, we would get a much more active interventionist IMF, which is what we need today. Okay, final point about the SDRs. $650 billion is very little. I know it's historic and all that, but that's because the IMF has been so wretchedly constrained. It hasn't really done what it's supposed to do. So it's very limited in terms of what is required. At the time of the crisis, most economists agree that you need a minimum of 1 trillion. Okay, 1 trillion additional SDRs. That was a year ago. So obviously a year and a half later, you need 2 trillion really to be realistic. And that would provide at least a significant proportion of the amount of money the IMF estimates that the developing countries are going to need. 500 billion or whatever. The problem is that SDRs are allocated according to quota. I mean, that's in the rules, that's in the Articles of Agreement. So it's going to be, or not in the Articles of Agreement, but when the SDRs were created, it was in that formulation. So it's going to take far too much to actually change that right now. However, SDRs can be recycled. And Aqdas, you mentioned that, what's the logistics of this? How do the central banks do this? It's fairly straightforward if there is political will. Because, the only cost of using the SDR is this interest rate, which is really low. I think it is, 0.06% or something. So there's hardly any fiscal cost involved. I mean, any government that is getting a huge gift of additional SDRs, which they're not going to use, can easily recycle it to other purposes, because the fiscal cost is negligible. It's non-existent practically. Now, notice that at least 20-30 of the major economies are not going to use these SDRs. The US, obviously, why should it use SDRs? It's got the dollar. Everybody uses the dollar. Most of Europe is not going to. Most of the advanced economies are not going to. China is not going to. It's a surplus economy. It's sitting on massive reserves. So we have many countries that are not going to use the SDRs. If we actually ask them to put this into a pool, a global pool, that would make available resources for global use. Immediately put 50 billion into COVAX. That's what they need, they claim, to distribute vaccines all over the world. Give 50 billion to COVAX. Immediately put money in a global public investment fund. Now, this is an idea which basically says, forget about foreign aid. Actually substitute all that foreign aid stuff with public investment by seeing the world as a whole, recognizing there are global challenges for humanity like climate change, and put investment where it's required to address those challenges. So a public investment, a global public investment fund of, let's say, starting with 500 billion, easily you could put money in there because, you know, these countries are sitting already on massive SDR reserves that they're not going to use. Instead, what is likely to happen? The little bit of recycling that will occur is going to be put into something called the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. It's a trust created by the IMF where they give low interest lending to poor countries. So already it's targeted to poor countries, but it's low interest lending. Guess what? It comes with the good old conditions. Same conditions that we now know are a mess. So if it goes into PRGT, it's as good as wasting it, honestly. The tragedy is that this allocation of SDRs is happening without enough public discussion and public demand for a different strategy of recycling. So that even this 650 billion, it's better than nothing for sure for many developing countries, but it's not going to be used in the ways that really matter. And I think that's where we need much more voice all over the world to demand that we have clear strategies for recycling that actually benefit developing countries. Okay, let me stop here and thank you all for letting me be part of this.
Can I just add another point for discussion here? I think you covered a very wide terrain, and thank you so much for your perspective. I think I've obtained some very good ideas, especially your idea about putting this money that these developed countries don't need to use in an international public investment fund, because definitely the kind of problems and challenges that we are facing as a civilization, as a human civilization, I mean, they cannot be dealt by any one single country. I mean, we are dealing with problems that are known as transboundary problems. I mean, we are talking about climate change, we are talking about vaccinating, at least 50% of the global population. So thank you for that suggestion. I mean, I just want to take you back and ask you or remind you that at the time when the negotiations for the next institutional framework, which we now know as the IMF, those negotiations were taking place at Bretton Woods. Keynes proposed a very interesting idea in the shape of an international clearing union. Now, my question is, one of the reasons why Keynes was not able to have, or his arguments did not win the day, had to do with the declining power of the British Empire, which was disintegrating as he was negotiating. He was basically negotiating an assistance package from the US for Great Britain. So, I mean, that's one reason. Now that we are seeing a potential rebalancing of power in the world, I mean, now we are seeing an empire in our neighborhood that appears to be very, very tired and exhausted. And we are seeing another country which is definitely on the ascendance. It is increasingly challenging this empire in South China Sea. It is building its bases, which is called string of pearls, all the way to Africa. How could the present institutional framework that is spearheaded by the IMF, how could that change in the years to come, given China's domination in the international economic system?
That is such a good question, and it's not an easy one to answer. So let's consider, you're right about Keynes's ideas not being taken on board. It was much more Harry Dexter White working for Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary in the US at the time, who succeeded in pushing the US view. But I think that's also because, Keynes was in a way kind of politically naive. He thought that, you could have a band of technocrats, men, actually. He thought there would be a band of these rational men who could sit, on top of the world and decide things, and they would do so in a just and equitable manner, and you could rely on them to be kind of, good about it. That's not how the world works. And I go back to Kindleberger. International money is about international power. And so Dexter White won out because the US was already the dominant power. The World War had actually made the US the dominant power by destroying Europe, So in a way, it was inevitable that the design would be what the US wanted. That in turn makes Keynes's idea of international money a little bit, again, naive, because he had imagined this Bancor, which was going to be global money issued by his International Clearing Union. Now, there are people today who argue for the SDR to become international liquidity issued by the IMF. My friend Jose Antonio Campo is a big advocate of this idea, for example. I think, once again, it leaves out the politics. The IMF it's not this wonderful technocratic deus ex machina outside the political system. It is a product of our rather messy global politics and global power relations. So until you have the great powers agreeing, and that would really mean distributing the world among themselves, which is not particularly desirable for the rest of us who are going to be distributed. But until you have that, you don't get, this kind of authority that will then distribute, that generate liquidity and distribute it. All money that we trust today comes from the power of a state. It comes backed by a state. When you have these conflicting states, and that's where your question becomes so interesting, where you have periods of clearly, shall we say, instability, periods of a rising power and a declining power. And by the way, this can go on for decades. It's not like it's going to be over next year or tomorrow or something. It can last for a while. These are periods where all kinds of options open up, but they are not stable options. We should not kid ourselves. Developing countries can certainly gain from these openings that happen because of the fact that there are great powers in conflict. And they can certainly try and change their position in the global division of labor. These are periods when that has happened, but these are not stable periods. These are not periods where you get a nice international framework. These are not periods where all the platitudes about international cooperation, which I am part of, I believe that we won't survive without it. But these are not periods when these work. Because there's too much at stake for both powers, the declining one and the rising one. So I think developing countries have to recognize that it's a different world, it's uncharted territory, it's not going to be a stable world, but it is a world in which, yes, you can do things like play off one against another, chart your own course without facing dire consequences where you won't get the whole global system coming down on you in the same way. It does create openings, but these are not the openings that come about in much more stable periods with existing frameworks and architectures. The reason why there's a concern here is because at the same time we've got climate change, right? Which you've mentioned. We are facing really apocalyptic threats, okay, against for human existence. And we have to cooperate for that. Everything I've told you does not suggest cooperation. So there is a fundamental problem. I wish I could be give you a better solution to this, but I see this as a deep contradiction.
Thank you for an answer. Before we go on, I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Ghosh, do you have time to stay on, or?
I'm really sorry, but I have to join another thing. And in fact, I'm already getting a phone call.
Perfectly all right. And
where are you?
Yeah. Perfectly all right. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank you profusely, both personally and from, my fellow coordinators of the YSI South Asia Working Group. We are so honored to have you participate in this event, and we look forward to hosting you again soon.
Yes, well, please don't say honored and all that. I am actually very happy and very proud at all what you're all doing. And I would like to encourage you in every way possible. So please keep it up. Please keep doing it. Thanks, everyone. And bye-bye. Yeah.
So,
all right. So we have, yes, Atif, please take over.
No, you go ahead, please.
All right. So we have had those wonderful questions being raised, some suggestions from Professor Ghosh. And now, Aqdas, would you like to take another 5 minutes to sort of condense your point of view and Jayati's point of view, and then we open up for the question and answer?
Okay, so thank you everyone for this participation. I just wanted to take our discussion or what we are talking about here a little bit forward. And some things that I have been thinking about, especially in the wake of the recent evacuation, or rather hasty evacuation of US and ISAF troops from Afghanistan. You know, how one fine day, the people in Kabul found out that the Americans were leaving and they were left at the mercy of, I don't know, some other forces. So this reminded me, probably, I mean, this idea or what has happened in Afghanistan after 20 years, probably something approaching like partition as it happened in India. You know, the British just wanted to wash their hands off of India. So they decided that they were just going to leave. You know, earlier they said they were going to leave on the 3rd of June, 1948, but then they decided to just leave 6 months or about 9 months sooner. And the ensuing chaos, some very tragic events, extremely tragic events took place in the wake of partition because of this fact that another Western power decided to jump ship because it was no longer in their economic interest to hold on to power. So this gave me this, so this got me thinking that, I mean, is there any possibility or is there any realistic possibility of the countries of the global South to get together and form their own international monetary union of sorts, so that instead of relying on the US and other Western countries, you know, countries of the global South would probably assist each other, or low-income economies for that matter, would assist each other when it comes to you know, needs for foreign exchange, when it comes to extending bilateral swap lines, when it comes to liquidity injections, so on and so forth. Because I don't know if you guys know, but out of the total external debt that Pakistan has, which is dollar denominated, according to one calculation, about 40 to 50% of that external debt denominated in US dollar is basically the fees that the consultants have charged for coming and telling us what we need to do. I don't know what's the going rate in New Delhi for international consultants, but these days I've heard that the going rate in Islamabad is $5,000 per day. $5,000 per day for international consultants. So that's just something that I wanted to put on the table as far as food for thought is concerned. And now I'm really interested in taking comments and questions from our participants. So maybe if people can raise their hand and one of you guys can then recognize, and then we can see how to go about discussing that point. I see that we had Adam here, who is a scholar in his own right. It's nice to see you, Adam.
Hi, Aqdas. It was a really nice presentation. Thank you so much for your thoughts, and I really learned a lot from this event. And actually, you know that I'm based in Europe, and actually I'm also very disappointed to see what is happening also in Afghanistan, and also regarding the COVID vaccination worldwide. And I do agree with Professor Ghosh that there should be some changes in the World Bank's policy. And I'm very interested about what you mentioned, the parallel situation when the UK, the British left India in 1948. And maybe if you could elaborate this parallel more deeply, that would be really nice to hear. Thank you.
Okay, so I think there are definitely parallels, but I mean, the nature of British colonization in India was, it was a very, very long period. I mean, so the British basically became the dominant power in India, after the Battle of Buxar, probably around 1757, 1758, something like that, after they basically took over the ability to collect revenues from Bengal. And then they finally leave in 1947. So we have had a very, very long period of British involvement in India, which is, proper colonization, which is when white Europeans came to, live in India for generations. And then we've had the establishment of this very peculiar institution that was known as the British Raj, that basically operated through two main institutions. Number one was the British Indian Army, basically manned by white European officers that basically provided cannon fodder for European or British campaigns in the First and the Second World War. And then the other institution, a peculiar institution that still exists, was the Indian Civil Service, which was known as the steel frame, that basically ran, in which initially white European officers who or managers who were known as deputy commissioners basically ran an entire district. These were basically representatives of the British Raj, a one-man army. They were in charge of revenue collection, they were in charge of education, they were in charge of law and order. Basically, anything happened within that district, the deputy commissioner was in charge of that. Now, I don't know how what I call de-Rajification, how much of that has happened in India, but in Pakistan, that hasn't really happened. We still have the same two institutions that exercise power in Pakistan. And I think a lot of Pakistan's problems emanate from not being able to de-Rajify Pakistan's political setup. Maybe one of you guys, Anisha or Shautik, can talk about the Indian situation when it comes to the ICS or the military. I know that democracy is completely consolidated in India, but as far as the ICS is concerned, I think they do exercise a lot of power still to this day.
Should I go? Okay. So ICS, you mean Indian Civil Service? They are the white elephant. And I think some weeks ago there was a new book which came to the market by Kaushik Basu. He discussed about his experience of working he was probably the advisor to Manmohan Singh government. And he said that the bureaucracy is it is more efficient than 50 years ago, but it's so he didn't probably use, but I will use the Raj-like organized. So if a file comes to you, there are options written on the cover page of the file. And you have to choose between those options, 16 to 18 options. Do it quickly, do it rapidly, do it rapidly, quickly, do it immediately. And each of these options, the officers will tick and pass judgment, and each having its own meaning. So some will mean that you have to do it by the night, others will mean whatever. So they have a lot of influence, and over the time there were many, I can't remember the names of the commissions, but there were commissions which recommended many reforms in the bureaucracy, but nothing has happened. Another thing I will say, that colonial legacy that we are carrying is the police. The police system, they are very good with sticks, and very good in terms of investigation. They can identify criminals and etc. But they are so politically controlled, doesn't work very well. These are some of the problems that we carry. But I want to come back to the point that you raised at the beginning, whether or not it's possible that countries of the global south or developing countries can come together, form some forms of financial institution that serves their purpose. It's like the ideal horror story in the sense that if we can come together, we could really do miracles. Imagine the kind of money Indian state spent for billions of dollars. I mean, they could have spent for development of millions in India, and poverty will be almost gone if we can save 1 year's of defense budget. Maybe 20% would be enough. But the politics and the clever use of fear of others, for Indians, Pakistan will attack, or China will attack, or some unknown guy sitting somewhere in the world will attack. So those politics and the greed to remain in power will always obstruct us from forming this kind of organization. But yeah, this kind of thing, I heard, this is a bit controversial, but Gaddafi once suggested a similar thing for Africa just before his, please stop now. Anyone else?
Look what happened to him for suggesting that.
Yeah, I stopped there because I was going to a very dangerous territory.
I think we also have, Anisha, you want to add something to this discussion, please?
Oh, sure. So I'll just go back to Adam's point and say, like, what parallels could we draw between, what's happening in the eastern side of the continent for our South Asia region and what happened with India with the imperial power. So I see a lot of differences, and I will just point out those differences, and then we go take Sangeet's question, right? So first is that it was a 20-year occupation with Afghanistan. For us, it was like a 200-year. The British were part and parcel of the entire system here. They created a lot of things that we still use, but as far as America is concerned, they sort of demolished, right? Even they couldn't sustain a strong democracy in that nation. So as soon as they went out, it was back to square one, which didn't happen with the Indian colony. So that's where we find this kind of differences. So there also exists a lot of damage when something like this happens. They do not know where the people have to go forward. Do they just surrender to the military forces that's happening right now, or they sort of fight for the democracy? So I think we will have to look more carefully when we say there are like parallels in the setup, which I think is not quite perfect, right? And also with respect to having this group of developing nations coming together, India started this non-alignment movement when there were like two blocks, during the Cold War. And that worked very well for developing nations who were getting independence at that point in time, right? They wanted to sort of maintain distance from both the blocks, exercise that independence. Something on those lines can also be we can look forward to, right? So try and maintain the political distance, try and develop a financial kind of a ring where developing nations work together. And with that, I will stop and we go for Sangeet. Yes, Sangeet, unmute yourself and go ahead, ask your question.
Hello. So I have been studying up some political science and international relations based topics. And in light of that, I had a question. So the thing that Dr. Aqdas and Satvik brought up, right? How power about China's rise and so on. I see a sort of a disconnect occurring between the economic rhetoric and the political rhetoric, if we can separate those two. So in the economic sphere, the rhetoric is mostly, am I still audible? Hello?
Yes.
Okay. In the economic sphere, the rhetoric we hear is mostly one of liberal or neoliberal terminology, while in the political arena, especially in international relations, it has always been realist, neo-realist, or neoconservative rhetoric that is dominating, right? So I was attending a session that was meant for foreign service officers of the Indian civil services, where the rhetoric is always one of antagonism between and the US and China and so on. And yeah, so my question, I guess, is how does this disconnect between the liberal and the neoconservative rhetorics in economics and politics affect the working of the IMF?
What was the last time? How does it affect the working of? What was the last acronym?
The IMF. The IMF.
Okay, sure. I think you asked a very, very interesting question, and thank you for tuning in and listening to what I had to say. I personally think that the two rhetorics are pretty similar to each other. I mean, let's look at them in turn. I mean, you're right that in the international economics, there is a neoliberal narrative that operates. And in the realm of international politics, you have a neo-realist narrative that seems to be getting all the attention. But if you read the work of a very famous professor, his name is Alex Wendt, W-E-N-D-T, Alex Wendt, who wrote this amazing book, The Social Theory of International Relations, 1997, in which he argues that neo-realist narrative and neoliberal narratives are very much similar because both of them operate or use identical ontological foundations. So when I talk about ontological foundations, I'm basically talking about rational, utility maximizing agents, the kind of agent that you find at the base of most of your mainstream economics. And there is a whole movement within political science that has tried to import these assumptions or these ontological foundations as far as agents in international politics is concerned. And the whole movement is called the micro foundations movement. So I know about this because I also happen to have a master's in political science from a mainstream political science department, the Ohio State University in the US, where Alex Wendt was one of my professors, and I was not satisfied with what they were teaching me. So I took a break. I worked for 5 years, and then I went back to the US on a Fulbright scholarship, this time to what is known as a heterodox economics program at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And it's only then that I really understood, what was really going on. So I would submit the following, that you've picked up on something very interesting, that there are definitely two narratives, but I think that these two narratives are not that much different from each other because both of them use the same ontological foundations. And please do look up The Social Theory of International Relations by Alex Wendt. And if you just read the first chapter, I think what I'm saying would become even more clear to you.
Thank you.
So we have with us Ajibola, and he is joining us from Africa. So Akanji, do you have something to add on to the present discussion on how IMF looks at Africa and its plans there?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, well, in my case, I've heard from the two speakers, and I will say that I got richly informed from their perspectives. And I will take it further from what they've both said. Now, Professor Ghosh, the woman, said that IMF is about politics, power and politics. Now, if it is about power and politics, no institution readily surrenders power. We cannot expect them to surrender the economic power which they have built over the years to us in the name of humanity. Now, how do we go about this? Dr. I don't know how to pronounce his name sincerely, but I like his face anyway. Dr. Aqdas yeah, said that, can we have homegrown approaches, maybe within the global south, Africa, Asia, etc. In my view, I believe we already have these approaches. In Africa here, we have the African Union, which is the umbrella for all African states. And we have the African Developmental Bank. And I'm so sure there are equivalents in Asia too. Particularly, I know that there is an Asian Developmental Bank. But then, how have all of these people, all of these institutions been able to contribute to the development of the global south? We should ask ourselves, the funds from the World Bank, the loans from the World Bank, the funds from the IMF, how have the countries of the global south been able to utilize it? In Nigeria here, there was a time they said they have borrowed money from the West to buy arms for the Nigerian military. And at the end of the day, you see these same arms being recovered from the rebel group, Boko Haram. So if we are anti-development by our own activities, we cannot expect the outside world to help us. Let the Western world keep loading Africa, where I am, with loans, with funds. There won't be development until we ourselves have a change of attitude. So the hypothesis that the West should surrender some of its power or should increase the aid into Africa, and from what I can see on ground here, will never work, except there is an homegrown approach to change our ways. That's my take on it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for enlightening us with your very interesting comments. I'd just like to open the floor and see if somebody else has a question or a comment on what they have heard today. Okay, so we have a few hands that have gone up. I saw, okay, so two of them. So let me first go to Mehek, and then we can go to Dharma.
Hello, Professor. I hope I'm audible. I feel extremely honored to be a part of a Zoom session that has been blessed by Dr. Ghosh, and it was all because of you. Thank you so much. And whatever you said has enhanced my knowledge of the IMF or what the system is like. My question is in two parts. Firstly, I want to know how eager would political leaders of the global south be for this unification of, I don't know, creating a monetary fund for just the global south? Because I remember the conference of Badung, it happened in 1955, and it was aimed at bringing together like the third world countries, and they were all discussing how they can empower themselves. But Jawaharlal Nehru had then said that he thinks that doing so would again create a sense of war in terms of West versus the global south. So he wanted to work independently and he wanted to boost India's economy. So I do think that what political leaders aim or think really impacts the decisions of the global south generally. My second question is about the term, the third world country. You see, in China is still considered by many Europeans as a third world country, but we can see that it's thriving more economically than most of the Western nations. So does a third world country mean a country that is non-European only? Because I see many third world countries thriving more than the Western nations. Thank you.
I think I'll try to answer your second question first. And that question was about, is China a third world country? The term third world country was used by a French intellectual in around 1951 or something like that. And he was just referring to, the countries which were becoming independent in the wake of the Second World War. So these new countries that were coming about in Africa and Asia. And so he referred to them as the third world. China is a very, very ancient civilization. I mean, China has been around. There's a recorded history of China for 5,000 years. And yes, China was poor, but China is no longer poor. And according to estimates, by the year 2027, so in about 6 years, the GDP of China is going to overtake US GDP in real terms. So it's going to have a bigger economy than the US in about 6-7 years. In purchasing power parity, it overtook the US in 2015. So China is not a third world country the way the term has been used, in popular understanding or in wider understanding. Your first question was about leaders, and you expressed some reservation about, can we expect leaders to have that kind of, how should I say, that mental or psychological evolution to get together and form institutions that are going to benefit all the countries of the global south. I think in many countries, including Pakistan, it's not just the leaders that have the power or the ability to push a particular country in the direction of agreements. I think there are other forces, lobbies, factions, institutions, what have you. So I think the change is going to come about. This is just my feeling, but I think we are very, very far from any such change. And I think a lot needs to take place in terms of, talking about things that we haven't talked about, talking about disputed regions, talking about disputes, talking about other differences before countries can come together. And I certainly hope that we can achieve that. I mean, if France and Germany, after having fought 2 world wars with each other, can come together and form the European Union, so can any other country. So I think I see an optimistic future for this region, for the global south. And let me take the last question from Dharma, because then we are going to have to close the session.
Okay, right. Can you hear me well, Dr. Afzal?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I'm Dharma. I'm Malaysian, by the way, so I'm more Southeast Asia. But I actually have some questions, particularly to get your insights and from this region. Just a bit of a background. I'm doing my master's in international trade law. So, but I'm doing it with EU, and it's a joint partnership with the UN. But it's not UNCTAD. It's more Washington consensus. So, my question would be, the first question would be, like previously, Professor Jayati said, it's not really a matter of terminology. It's not whether it's neoliberal or socialist or neorealist. It's more of whether the framework is working or not. And she said that the framework, as per Bretton Woods framework, is not working because of the way it's structured, and particularly with the IMF and the SDR. So my first question would be, do you see any aspect of the current framework that needs to shift as opposed to breaking it down totally? So that would be tweaking the framework. My second question would be on Taliban. So with Taliban, what I read and understood, it was a matter of a vacuum. And when there's a vacuum, then it depends, a power vacuum. So then it would be a matter of who wants to leave and who wants to stay. And so as it stands now, China seems to have decided to stay, and Russia is also in it. But with respect to the EU, they have their own strategy of handling Taliban. Do you have any thoughts on that one? Thank you.
Shautek, do you want to answer the first question maybe? Because that's more up your alley.
I'm so ashamed to tell you, but I don't have any expertise on that. You are the master here. Please.
Okay, so let me try to answer the second question, and I think I'll only get to answering the second question because that is more interesting and more urgent in a sense. And maybe if Dharma, you and I could talk about this offline, I think that would be also okay. I don't know if I can, if one of you coordinators can share my email with Dharma, so she can, send me a question.
Yes, if if you
Yeah.
have time, after we formally end this recorded session, we can talk.
Okay. So I think as far as your question on Afghanistan is concerned, I don't think there was a vacuum in Afghanistan. I think there was a government there that was trying to do a lot of things, but it wasn't particularly successful because of two main reasons. I think the first reason had to do with the composition of the government in Afghanistan, the one that is now no longer in charge. And I think they consciously decided to keep one of the biggest ethnic groups within Afghanistan out of power. And I think that was basically because most of them had been fighting against the Taliban, back in the day, and they decided to keep them out. So that was never going to work in the long run. So I think little by little, incrementally, they started losing ground to Taliban, which is basically not really an, how should I say, which is not really as organized as a modern state. It's more of an ideological movement than it is anything else. And the second reason, according to some people, had to do with corruption. I mean, I think the previous government in Afghanistan was extremely corrupt, I mean, according to certain estimates. And that definitely eroded its legitimacy. It eroded its ability to carry out development work, and it's eroded its ability to focus on Afghanistan's immediate problems. And I think so that's probably why we see what we see in Afghanistan today. Your comment about EU, I think I'm extremely disappointed with the kind of voices that I have heard coming out of EU. For example, the EU spokesperson has categorically stated that they are not going to accept any Afghan refugees. I think that is just that's just a position that I think is untenable, because I think for the longest time you've had European forces in the shape of ISAF conducting operations in Afghanistan. So I think there is some responsibility that should also be shouldered by European nations in settling Afghan refugees. And I think for your first question, we can either talk about that offline. You can probably shoot me an email. If I can just write down my email here in the chat, so that anybody who has any question can send me an email, and we can then talk about that. And I think we are out of time, and I have to go to another event. I mean, it's not that just Dr. Ghosh has to go to other events. I also have to go to other events, because I am participating in a webinar on the fast collapsing Afghan economy, because that now I think is the number one concern that is at least about which at least I'm extremely worried, because I think that is going to be a full-blown economic and human rights catastrophe, when the economy collapses in Afghanistan. I hope doesn't happen.
So with this, Anisha, are you there? Okay, for some reason she's not there. So I take the liberty to officially conclude the session. I'd like to thank very much to Dr. Aqdas Afzal, our coordinator, for sharing his valuable time with us. Thank you for your words and wisdom and everything. And today is Teachers' Day, by the way, in India. So it's a day also to share our gratitude to you. As a teacher, you must be very dear to your student. Thank you. And thanks to all of you for attending. And thanks to Professor Ghosh for joining us. Maybe next time we will get her for longer time than this time. But anyway, thank you all for joining us. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.